At 0600 hours on June 6, 1944, Staff Sergeant James Rencher waded into the cold water off Utah Beach. He carried 40 pounds of explosives strapped to his body. Wire cutters hung from his belt. Primacord coiled around his shoulder. A mine detector dangled from one hand. Around him, 200 other combat engineers from the 531st Amphibious Regiment moved through the surf toward the German beach obstacles. They had 30 minutes to clear a 50-yard-wide lane through the mines, steel barriers, and underwater obstacles before the main assault waves arrived. Rencher was part of a three-man team. 2 other engineers moved with him through the murky water. They could barely see 10 feet ahead. The pre-dawn darkness and churning waves made visibility nearly impossible. But they knew exactly where to go and what to do. For the past 6 months, they had practiced this mission 100 times on English beaches. They had rehearsed every movement until it was automatic. Find the obstacles. Attach the explosives. Move to the next target. They worked together with practiced coordination, each man knowing his role. The first obstacle Rencher encountered was a steel cable stretched underwater to snag landing craft. The cable was 2 inches thick, strong enough to stop a boat and hold it in place while German guns destroyed it. Rencher felt along the cable in the dark water until he found a support point. He wrapped plastic explosive around the steel. His teammate attached the detonator and connected primacord to link this charge to others they would set. They moved on. The next obstacle was a wooden post angled seaward with a teller mine attached to the top. The mine held 11 pounds of explosives designed to detonate when a landing craft struck it. Rencher and his team wrapped more plastic explosive around the post below the waterline. They could not simply defuse the mine. There was no time. Defusing required careful work, removing detonators, checking for anti-tampering devices. The mission was not to make German mines safe. The mission was to destroy everything in their path as quickly as possible. Explosive charges would blow the posts, the mines, the steel barriers, and the cable simultaneously. The resulting gaps would allow landing craft to reach the beach. Behind Rencher, 16 other three-man teams worked on adjacent obstacles. Each team had a specific sector to clear. Together, the 200 engineers would create multiple lanes through the German defenses. The plan was precise. Intelligence had photographed the obstacles from aircraft. Engineers had studied the images, identifying each type of barrier. They knew the spacing, the layout, the probable mine locations. The training had replicated these exact conditions. Now they executed what they had practiced. For the first hour, the Germans did not fire at them. The engineers worked in the semi-darkness, partially concealed by spray and morning mist. The German defenders on the bluffs above the beach did not see them or did not recognize what was happening. By the time full daylight came and German gunners spotted the engineers, much of the work was finished. Rencher's team had destroyed the cable, blown 6 posts with attached mines, and demolished 3 hedgehog barriers, steel angles designed to rip hulls. They had worked for nearly an hour in waist-deep water, moving methodically from obstacle to obstacle. Then the firing started. Machine guns from German positions swept the beach. Mortar rounds began falling into the surf. The engineers were exposed, standing in open water with no cover. Some were hit immediately. Rencher saw men fall. He kept working. The mission was not complete. There were still obstacles to clear. The main assault waves were approaching. If the lanes were not finished, landing craft would be destroyed. The invasion could fail. Everything depended on finishing the job. The story of combat engineers on D-Day is not about individual heroes defusing 200 mines alone. It is about teams of men working together under impossible conditions. It is about systematic training that prepared them for the worst day of their lives. It is about courage measured not in dramatic solo actions but in disciplined execution of dangerous tasks while friends died around them. It is about the unglamorous, terrifying work that made the invasion possible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the story of how Allied combat engineers prepared for D-Day, how they trained for months to clear beach obstacles in minutes, How the German defensive plan relied on mines and barriers to stop the invasion. How engineer teams worked under fire to create gaps for the assault troops. How the reality of mine clearing was teamwork, not individual heroism. How hundreds of engineers died making the landings possible. And how the men who survived carried memories of that day for the rest of their lives. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel understood that Germany could not defeat an Allied invasion at sea. The Kriegsmarine had lost control of the Atlantic. The Luftwaffe could not challenge Allied air superiority. If the Allies reached the French coast, they would land. Rommel's strategy focused on making the beaches so deadly that the invasion would fail before it could establish a foothold. He envisioned killing the assault troops in the water and on the sand before they could organize. The defensive plan centered on obstacles. Rommel ordered the construction of multiple barrier lines extending from the high water mark down into the surf zone. The obstacles served several purposes. They would damage or destroy landing craft trying to reach the beach. They would slow the assault troops, keeping them exposed to defensive fire longer. They would channel attacking forces into killing zones covered by pre-registered artillery and machine gun fire. And they would create chaos, disrupting the carefully planned assault. The obstacles took various forms. Farthest from shore, at the low water mark, Rommel placed timber posts angled seaward. The posts were thick tree trunks driven deep into the sand. Teller mines were attached to the tops. When landing craft struck the posts at high tide, the mines would detonate, destroying the boats and killing everyone aboard. The posts were positioned to be invisible at high tide, creating a submerged death trap. Closer to shore were Belgian gates. Steel frameworks 10 feet tall that would rip the bottoms out of landing craft. Then came Czech hedgehogs, obstacles made from steel angle iron or railroad rails welded together at the center. 3 pieces formed a star pattern that would puncture hulls or catch on propellers. Closer still were tetrahedrons, steel pyramids that served similar purposes. All of these obstacles were designed to stop, damage, or delay landing craft. On the beach itself, additional barriers waited. Steel stakes driven into the sand, concrete obstacles, barbed wire, and mines. Millions of mines. Rommel wanted 300 million mines planted on the French beaches. He did not achieve that goal, logistics and time prevented it. But by June 6, 1944, more than 4 million mines had been laid. They were buried in the sand, attached to obstacles hidden in the dunes. Teller mines designed to destroy vehicles. S-mines that would spring into the air and spray shrapnel. Anti-personnel mines that would maim infantry. The defensive system was formidable. Rommel believed that if the Allies attempted a high-tide landing, as he expected, the submerged obstacles would devastate the assault. The Allies would lose hundreds of landing craft. Thousands of soldiers would die in the water, never reaching the beach. Those who survived would face minefields and concrete fortifications. Machine guns and artillery would cut them down. The invasion would fail in the first hours. Allied planners understood the threat. Aerial reconnaissance photographed the beaches repeatedly during the spring of 1944. Intelligence analyzed the images, identifying each obstacle type. They counted posts, measured spacing, noted mine positions. The photographs revealed the extent of Rommel's defensive work. The obstacles were dense, professionally constructed, and covered by fire from fortified positions. Clearing them would require specialized troops with specific training and equipment. The mission fell to combat engineers. Both the United States Navy and the United States Army formed specialized units for beach obstacle demolition. The Navy created naval combat demolition units, teams of officers and enlisted men trained in underwater demolition. The Army formed engineer special brigades with companies dedicated to obstacle and mine clearance. These units trained together, developing coordinated procedures for the assault. The training was intense and realistic. Beginning in December 1943, engineer units practiced beach clearance operations on English coastlines. They used actual German obstacle designs, constructed from intelligence photographs. They practiced with live explosives, learning to work quickly under pressure. They rehearsed evacuation procedures when wounded. They drilled on communication protocols. They repeated the mission until every movement was automatic. Staff Sergeant Rencher described the training regimen. We worked hard every day. We made 100 mock invasions, just our battalion, maybe 500 men. We'd use an English beach. We'd come ashore with the battalion and practice on simulated mines laid out on the beaches. The repetition was deliberate. In combat, there would be no time to think or plan. Men would be terrified, exhausted under fire. Only ingrained habits developed through countless repetitions would function under those conditions. The engineers learned to work as teams. A typical naval combat demolition unit consisted of 1 officer and 5 enlisted men. An Army engineer demolition team had 16 men divided into specialized roles. Some carried explosives. Others managed detonation equipment. Some had mine detectors. Others marked cleared lanes. Each man knew his job and how it fit into the overall mission. The teams practiced together until they could execute complex demolition sequences with minimal communication. They also learned the capabilities and limitations of their equipment. The primary explosive was C2 plastic explosive, moldable and waterproof. It could be shaped around obstacles and detonated reliably even when wet. Primacord, detonating cord, connected multiple charges, allowing simultaneous detonation. Electric blasting caps provided precise timing. Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes filled with explosive, could clear barbed wire and mine paths. Each tool had specific applications that engineers mastered through practice. The plan for D-Day called for engineer teams to land ahead of the main assault waves. At H-hour-5 the first teams would wade ashore and begin clearing obstacles. They would work from the low water mark toward the high water mark, blowing gaps 50 yards wide. The gaps would be marked with colored flags and buoys so landing craft could navigate to safe channels. By H-hour+30, 16 gaps should be cleared across each beach sector, allowing the massive follow-on waves to land safely. The plan was ambitious. It required engineers to place explosives on hundreds of obstacles while exposed to enemy fire. It required precise coordination between Navy and Army teams. It required that demolitions be timed to avoid destroying landing craft passing through the gaps. It required clear marking systems visible through smoke and spray. And it required that all of this happen in 30 minutes while men were being killed. The teams were told to expect 90% casualties. Officers briefing the engineers explained that most would die or be wounded within the first 2 hours. The mission's importance outweighed the cost. If the obstacles were not cleared, the invasion would fail. Tens of thousands of troops would die on the beaches. The war might be lost. The engineers accepted their mission understanding that they were likely to die performing it. On the night of June 5, 1944, the engineer units boarded landing craft in England. Rencher and his teammates climbed into an LCM, landing craft mechanized, with explosives, equipment, and 93 men crammed into a vessel designed for far fewer. They were overloaded, dangerously so, but the mission required all the engineers and all their equipment to reach the beach together. The crossing was rough. Heavy seas made the men seasick. Water sloshed over the sides. Everyone was cold, wet, and miserable before they ever saw France. As dawn approached on June 6, the massive invasion fleet reached the Normandy coast. Battleships and cruisers began bombardment of German positions. Bombers struck defensive installations. The noise was tremendous. Thousands of guns firing, bombs exploding, engines roaring. Through this chaos, the engineer teams prepared for their approach. They checked equipment. They reviewed assignments. They waited for the order to move toward the beach. At Utah Beach, the engineer teams went in first. Rencher's unit hit the water at approximately 0600 hours. The landing craft could not reach the beach because of the obstacles. The engineers had to wade the last several hundred yards through surf, carrying their heavy loads of explosives. The water was cold, around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The weight of equipment dragged at them. Waves knocked men off their feet, but they pushed forward toward the obstacle line. The experience was surreal. Rencher later described the strange quiet during the first hour. During the time the 200 of us engineers were in the water, we had no fire at all from the Germans on the beach. We had no fire at all for the first hour. They didn't see us, and they didn't know we were there. The engineers moved through the obstacles methodically, placing charges, connecting primacord, preparing for detonation. The work was exactly what they had practiced. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The reality of clearing beach obstacles bore no resemblance to the image of a lone engineer defusing mines one by one. The teams did not defuse mines. They destroyed them. Defusing required time, specialized tools, and calm conditions. None of those existed on D-Day. Instead, engineers wrapped plastic explosive around posts holding mines. The explosion would destroy both post and mine simultaneously. For obstacles without mines, engineers used shaped charges or Bangalore torpedoes. Speed was essential. Precision was secondary. The technique worked. Within the first hour, the 200 engineers at Utah Beach cleared multiple 50-yard gaps through the obstacle belt. They blew the underwater cable. They destroyed posts with mines. They demolished hedgehogs and tetrahedrons. They marked the cleared lanes with colored flags. When the main assault waves arrived at H-hour, they had safe channels to the beach. The careful preparation and realistic training paid off. The teams executed their mission despite impossible conditions. But the cost was severe. Once the Germans realized what was happening, they directed intense fire at the engineers. Machine guns swept the water. Mortars dropped into the surf. Artillery targeted the obstacle lanes. The engineers had no cover, no protection except the water itself. Many were hit. Some died instantly. Others were wounded and drowned before teammates could reach them. The casualties mounted rapidly. At Omaha Beach, the situation was far worse. The assault plan went wrong from the beginning. Strong currents pushed landing craft off course. Units landed in the wrong sectors. The naval bombardment failed to destroy German fortifications. When the engineer teams arrived, they found themselves under withering fire from intact German positions. Machine guns on the bluffs had clear fields of fire across the entire beach. Every engineer was exposed. The Omaha Beach engineer teams attempted to execute their mission under conditions even worse than anticipated. They landed alongside the first infantry waves rather than ahead of them. The beach was crowded with men seeking cover. Wounded soldiers lay among the obstacles. Disabled vehicles blocked lanes. And German fire was intense, accurate, and continuous. Engineers trying to place explosives were killed before they could finish. Charges were set but could not be detonated because infantry were too close. The careful plan dissolved into chaos. Despite the confusion, some teams succeeded. Individual Navy combat demolition units and Army engineer teams cleared partial gaps. They worked around wounded men, placed charges during lulls in firing, and detonated obstacles when possible. But the losses were catastrophic. Of the 16 Navy teams assigned to Omaha Beach, casualties approached 70%. Some teams were entirely wiped out. Equipment was destroyed. The 50-yard gaps that were supposed to be cleared remained partially blocked. The engineers at Omaha demonstrated extraordinary courage under the worst possible conditions. They continued working while men died around them. When teammates were hit, others took over their tasks. When equipment was destroyed, they improvised. When the plan failed, they adapted. By the end of D-Day, they had cleared enough gaps for the assault to continue. It was not the clean, efficient operation rehearsed in training. It was desperate, costly, and barely adequate, but it was enough. The work did not end on D-Day. For days and weeks after the initial assault, engineers continued clearing obstacles and mines. The Germans had sown minefields behind the beaches, in the fields, along roads, around fortifications. Every advance required engineer teams to sweep for mines, probe for booby traps, and clear paths for vehicles and infantry. The danger was constant. Mines killed and maimed engineers throughout the Normandy campaign. The clearing techniques varied depending on conditions. In open areas, engineers used mine detectors, electronic devices that sensed metal underground. The detector operator would sweep the ground in a methodical pattern, marking detected mines with flags or tape. Other engineers would then carefully excavate around each mine, identify the type, and either remove the detonator or destroy the mine in place with a small charge. This work was slow, dangerous, and required steady nerves. In areas where mine detectors were impractical, muddy ground, areas with metal debris, or under fire, engineers used probe rods. The technique involved carefully pushing a thin metal rod into the ground at an angle, feeling for the resistance of a buried mine. When a mine was located, the engineer would mark it and move on. Later, teams would return to destroy the mines or clear them. Probing was even slower than using detectors and more dangerous. A careless probe could detonate a mine. The fastest method was the flail tank. British forces deployed Sherman tanks modified with rotating drums mounted on the front. Heavy chains attached to the drums would whip the ground ahead of the tank, detonating mines through pressure. Flail tanks could clear paths through minefields relatively quickly, but they were noisy, attracted enemy fire, and could not guarantee complete clearance. Engineers still had to follow behind and sweep for any mines the flail missed. The psychological toll of mine-clearing work was severe. Engineers knew that any step might be their last. Any probe might trigger an explosion. Any mine they excavated might have an anti-handling device that would detonate when moved. The stress was cumulative. Men who worked with mines for weeks developed nervous habits, struggled to sleep, and suffered what would later be recognized as combat stress reaction. But the work had to continue. Mines blocked every route of advance. The German defenders understood how to maximize mines' psychological impact. They booby-trapped obvious paths, forcing engineers to work more slowly. They placed mines in patterns designed to funnel troops into kill zones. They sometimes left areas deliberately free of mines, then ambushed clearance teams that assumed the area was safe. The mental warfare was as important as the physical danger. American engineers learned to respect but not fear the mines. Training helped. Men who understood how mines functioned, how to detect them, and how to render them safe felt more confident than those who saw mines as mysterious killers. Experience helped more. Engineers who survived their first encounters with mines developed techniques and instincts that improved their survival odds. Veterans taught new replacements the practical skills that training could not fully convey. The title's image of a single engineer defusing 200 mines in 8 hours was physically impossible given the techniques and conditions of 1944. Defusing a single German mine, properly excavating it, identifying the type, removing anti-tampering devices, and extracting the detonator might take 30 minutes to an hour. 200 mines would require hundreds of hours. And no engineer worked alone. The buddy system was mandatory. One man worked while another watched for enemy activity and provided immediate help if something went wrong. What was possible and what actually happened was teams of engineers clearing sections of beach or minefield through coordinated effort. At Utah Beach, 200 engineers cleared multiple gaps in 1 hour by working simultaneously. Each three-man team handled multiple obstacles. Collectively, they achieved what appeared impossible individually. This was the reality of combat engineering: success through teamwork, coordination, and shared sacrifice. The recognition that engineers received was limited. Infantry divisions that crossed the cleared beaches became famous. Airborne units that jumped into France attracted public attention. Tank commanders and infantry leaders were decorated and celebrated. Combat engineers who made the landings possible worked largely in obscurity. Their missions were unglamorous. Their casualties were high. Their contribution was essential but rarely acknowledged in popular accounts. Staff Sergeant Rencher survived D-Day. His buddy Ham did not. Ham had been certain he would survive while others died. He was wrong. A mine explosion took both his legs. He died shortly after from shock and blood loss, unable to accept that his baseball career was over. Rencher carried that memory for the rest of his life. He also carried memories of the engineers who died in the surf, blown apart while placing charges. He remembered men who drowned when wounded, unable to stay afloat with their heavy equipment. He remembered the noise, the cold, the fear, and the desperate work that had to be finished regardless of cost. The roads used by troops advancing from the beaches were later named after engineers killed on D-Day. It was small recognition for men who died making the invasion possible. Their names on road signs in Normandy served as reminders that the success of June 6 came from thousands of individual acts of courage, most performed by men whose names are forgotten. The technical challenge of mine clearing evolved throughout the war and beyond. The Germans developed increasingly sophisticated mines with anti-handling devices, pressure-release triggers, and combination fusing systems. Allied engineers developed countermeasures and improved detection equipment. The arms race between mine designers and clearance specialists continued into the post-war period and persists today. Modern mines are far more sophisticated than World War II devices, but the fundamental problem remains the same. Mines must be found and rendered safe, and the work is always dangerous. The lesson of D-Day engineer operations is that critical missions require trained teams, not individual heroes. The engineers who landed on Normandy beaches had spent months learning to work together. They understood their equipment. They had practiced their procedures until they were automatic. When the moment came, they executed their mission despite casualties that would have broken untrained units. Their success came from preparation, discipline, and collective courage. The myth of the lone engineer defusing 200 mines minimizes what actually happened. Real engineers worked in teams under fire, using explosives to destroy obstacles they did not have time to carefully disarm. They died in large numbers. They accomplished their mission through coordination and shared risk. Their story is more impressive than any fictional individual achievement because it is true. It represents the reality of combat engineering, dangerous, unglamorous, essential work performed by ordinary men who did extraordinary things together. The combat engineers of D-Day deserve recognition not for mythical solo heroics but for the real courage they showed. They waded into enemy fire carrying explosives. They worked methodically while friends died. They completed missions with casualty rates that would be considered catastrophic by any standard. They made the invasion possible through teamwork and sacrifice. That is the story worth telling. That is the achievement worth honoring. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.